The Humvee was never designed to survive explosions. It wasn't built to take hits, and it was never meant to protect its crew from a battlefield like Iraq. But that's exactly where it ended up. For years, it was one of the most recognizable vehicles in the US military. Fast, reliable, everywhere. It moved troops, carried weapons, supported entire operations. But then the war changed. Not into something bigger, something different. Roadside bombs, hidden explosives, ambushes in cities. And suddenly, the Humvee was no longer just a transport vehicle. It became a target. A vehicle built for movement was forced to survive a war it was never designed for. And in that war, its biggest strength became its greatest weakness. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to a different kind of war. A war that never actually happened. The Humvee was born in the final decades of the Cold War. At that time, the United States was preparing for a large-scale conflict in Europe. Not insurgencies, not roadside bombs, but a fast-moving, high-intensity war against a technologically advanced enemy. In that kind of battlefield, speed mattered more than protection. Units needed to move quickly, adapt fast, cover long distances across unpredictable terrain. And for that, the military didn't need a heavily armored vehicle. It needed something else, a vehicle that could do almost everything. Transport troops, carry weapons, act as a mobile platform for communication, logistics, and support. Not a frontline fighter, but the system behind the fighters. That was the idea behind the Humvee. It replaced older, fragmented solutions, jeeps, light trucks, improvised platforms, with a single, unified design. One vehicle, dozens of roles, and it worked. In early operations, the Humvee proved exactly what it was designed to be: fast, reliable, flexible. It moved troops through difficult terrain, carried equipment where heavier vehicles couldn't go, supported operations without slowing them down. In wars like Panama and later in the Gulf War, everything aligned with its original concept. The battlefield was open, the enemy was visible, and most importantly, the Humvee was not the primary target. It operated around the front line, not inside it. And as long as that remained true, the design made perfect sense. But that assumption didn't last. And then came Iraq. And this time, it was not a test of doctrine, it was a test of reality. The Humvee entered Iraq as part of a modern, highly organized military machine. In theory, it still occupied the role it was designed for: mobility, support, logistics, reconnaissance, command transport. It was supposed to move around danger, not through it. It was supposed to support the battlefield, not exist inside its most dangerous parts. But the battlefield in Iraq did not behave like a battlefield in the traditional sense. There was no clear front line, no stable rear area, no safe zones that could be assumed safe by default. The war dissolved into a network of roads, cities, checkpoints, and unpredictable routes. One convoy could pass through the same road safely in the morning and encounter a hidden explosive in the afternoon. Control of territory did not guarantee control of safety. The enemy adapted to this environment faster than the doctrine did. They did not rely on armored formations or air power. They did not need to win open engagements. Instead, they focused on something far simpler and far more difficult to counter: unpredictability. The battlefield became a system of hidden pressure points where the moment of engagement was chosen entirely by the attacker. And this is where the Humvee was fundamentally displaced. It was never designed to survive a war where the ground itself could become a weapon. Improvised explosive devices became one of the defining threats of the conflict. Unlike traditional mines, they were not standardized or predictable. They could be placed anywhere: roads, intersections, urban streets, rural highways, and detonated at the exact moment a vehicle passed over them. Some were simple. Others were engineered with enough power to destroy vehicles far larger and more heavily protected than anything the Humvee was intended to face. The problem was not just the explosion itself, it was the direction of the threat. The Humvee's design assumed that danger would come primarily from distance. Gunfire, light artillery, small arms, threats that could be mitigated through speed, maneuver, and situational awareness. But IEDs bypassed all of that. They struck from below, from a point the vehicle was never structurally optimized to resist. The flat underside, acceptable in earlier doctrine, became one of its most critical vulnerabilities. At the same time, urban combat intensified the pressure even further. In cities, visibility collapsed. Engagement distances shrank to seconds. Enemy fighters did not need to engage in prolonged firefights. They could appear, strike, and disappear within the same environment. Rooftops, alleyways, and civilian infrastructure became layered threat zones. The Humvee, designed for movement and support, was now operating in conditions where every movement carried immediate risk. What made this even more dangerous was the shift in role. In Iraq, Humvees were no longer staying behind armored formations as originally intended. They were used in convoy protection, patrols, urban operations, and supply routes that directly intersected with hostile territory. In practice, they were constantly at the edge of contact or already inside it. The distinction between support vehicle and combat vehicle began to disappear. And once that distinction collapsed, the design itself started to reveal its limits. Light armor that had been sufficient against small arms fire could not reliably stop blast effects from below. The geometry of the vehicle offered little protection against upward force. The internal structure, optimized for mobility and versatility, provided limited survivability when exposed to repeated or concentrated attacks. Even when the vehicle remained intact, the shockwaves alone could injure or kill the crew inside. The result was not a single point of failure, but a systemic mismatch. A vehicle designed around speed, adaptability, and logistical flexibility was now being used in an environment defined by concealment, explosive force, and controlled ambush. Every core assumption behind its design was being inverted in real time. The response from the military came quickly, but it was fundamentally reactive. Armor kits were added to improve protection against ballistic threats. Additional plating was installed in the field. Improvised upgrades appeared as units tried to compensate for new risks as they emerged. These changes did improve survivability in certain situations, but they came at a cost. Weight increased, mobility decreased, mechanical strain grew. And even with these modifications, the core vulnerability, attacks from below, remained unresolved. The vehicle was being pushed beyond its design envelope, but the battlefield did not adjust to match it. And this is where a deeper realization began to emerge within military thinking. The problem was not simply insufficient armor or outdated equipment. The problem was that the entire concept of protection had been built on the assumption that threats could be managed through incremental upgrades. But Iraq demonstrated something more fundamental. If the nature of the threat changes, adding more of the same solution does not necessarily solve the problem. At some point, you do not upgrade the vehicle. You rethink it entirely. Because in Iraq, the Humvee did not just face stronger enemies. It faced a different logic of warfare, a logic where visibility, predictability, and structural assumptions about the battlefield no longer held. And from that realization, a new category of vehicle began to take shape, one that did not try to adapt the old model, but replaced its core principle altogether, the MRAP. But MRAPs did not replace the Humvee. They appeared because something was missing. Not a better version of the same vehicle, but a role that had never been fully defined before. Iraq didn't just expose a weakness, it forced a separation. A line that had never been clearly drawn suddenly became impossible to ignore. On one side, survival. On the other, mobility. MRAPs took one path. They were built around a single idea: survive the blast, survive the ambush, survive the moment you cannot avoid. Heavy, high, reinforced from below, designed not to escape the explosion, but to endure it. The Humvee stayed on the other side, fast, light, adaptable, still built to move, not to absorb, to support, not to withstand continuous attack. And that difference mattered, because the Humvee was never meant to live on the front edge of danger. It was meant to operate around it, to move through gaps, to connect systems, to keep everything else working. Iraq showed what happens when you force it into the wrong role. It suffers, not because it fails, but because it's being used against its own logic. And yet, something important became clear. The idea behind the Humvee was still correct, just not on its own. Modern warfare does not need one perfect vehicle. It needs a system, a structure where each machine does one thing well and survives because the others exist. MRAPs became vehicles of survival, built for the most dangerous routes, the highest risk zones, the places where you expect the explosion. The Humvee remained something else: movement, flexibility, reach. It carried troops, equipment, command systems. It connected units. It adapted faster than heavier machines ever could. And over time, that adaptability expanded. The Humvee stopped being just a vehicle. It became a platform, a base that could be reshaped depending on the mission. One version carried heavy weapons, machine guns, grenade launchers, missile systems, turning mobility into firepower. Another became reconnaissance, sensors, radios, surveillance, acting as the eyes of the battlefield. Others turned into mobile command posts, ambulances, engineering vehicles, electronic warfare platforms. Some were built to be deployed by air, dropped into places where heavier vehicles simply could not go. Each version different, but all built on the same idea: flexibility over specialization. And that is the real legacy of the Humvee. Not armor, not firepower, not survivability in the traditional sense. Adaptability. Even after Iraq, even after MRAPs, even after the battlefield changed, it continues to exist, not because it is the strongest machine, but because it can become what the situation requires. And in modern war, that ability can matter just as much as armor.